Welcome to the Grade 8 History Toolbox. Just like any other subject, there is certain terminology or certain skills that you need to have in order to optimize or make the best of your history experience.
Primary means first, or first-hand. So think of primary sources as materials that are first-hand. They're connected to an historical event because they were created during the time of the event or because they involve someone who participated first-hand. For example, if you're researching the civil rights movement in Minnesota, you might find primary sources related to Matthew Little, a Minneapolis civil rights activist who went to the March on Washington in 1963. Little listened to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. deliver his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Little wrote notes and letters about that day, and someone took photos of Little at the march. Notes, letters, photos. These are all primary sources because they document Little's first-hand experiences with the civil rights movement. In your research, you might also find this oral history interview with civil rights activist Nellie Stone Johnson, which is also a primary source.
And these organizations all got together and formed a coalition.
Even though the interview was recorded after the civil rights movement, it's still a primary source because Johnson was involved firsthand in the movement. Other examples of primary sources include newspaper articles, autobiographies, maps, government records, art, and films. As long as the item is from the time you're researching or documents someone's first-hand experience, it's a primary source. Something else to remember, it doesn't matter if you're looking at the original primary source or a copy of the primary source. They are both primary sources. Secondary, of course, means after first. So secondary sources are materials created after a historical event. Let's say you're still researching the Civil Rights Movement, and you're looking for information about Lena Olive Smith, Minnesota's first female African-American lawyer. This article about Smith was written by a law professor in 2001, well after the Civil Rights Movement, so it's a secondary source. Here's a web page about Smith. It was created in 2014, so it's also a secondary source. Secondary sources include books, biographies, articles, dissertations, websites, and documentary films, as long as they were written about a person or historical event at a later time. Many secondary sources get their information from primary sources. Just look at the footnotes or bibliography at the end of the secondary source to see what primary sources were used. Let's test your knowledge. Here's a photocopy of the Minneapolis Spokesman newspaper from April 1968, soon after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Is this a primary or secondary source? It's a primary source because the newspaper is from the time of the assassination. Even though it's a photocopy and not the original paper itself, it's still a primary source. Here's a book about the Civil Rights Movement, written by a history professor and published in 1990. Is it a primary or secondary source? It's a secondary source because it was written after the Civil Rights Movement by someone who was not a first-hand participant. This is a book of letters written by Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball. It was published in 2007. Is it a primary or secondary source? It's a primary source. Even though it was published in 2007, it contains copies of letters written by Robinson, a first-hand participant in the Civil Rights Movement. Now that you know what primary and secondary sources are, have fun researching. And remember, if you need help, ask a librarian. You can call, email, or ask questions in person. Visit www.mnhs.org/library for more information.
In history, you will often find what is known as political cartoons. These cartoons are for you to analyze an historical event. Often there is a hidden meaning in the cartoon, and if you don't know some of the facts, the cartoon will make no sense to you. So the next section of this lesson is the benefits of using political cartoons in history and how to make sense of the cartoon you are looking at.
Hello, and welcome to this presentation about how to read a political cartoon. I'm Mr. Nofke.
And I'm Mrs. Berg.
And today we're going to walk you through the different ways you can apply your skills to analyze political cartoons. Your target for the day is to identify the characteristics of a political cartoon to gain understanding of a cultural impression of an issue. So let's begin with this. What is a political cartoon? A political cartoon is an illustration or cartoon that contains a message that relates to current events or people. What's the purpose? Well, there's lots of purposes of political cartoons. I mean, let's be honest. They're entertaining. They're fun. We get a laugh out of them. But they also offer us insights into certain cultural assumptions or attitudes towards current events or events in history. And sometimes the author will use them to persuade the reader to their point of view by offering them insights or to lead them down a path of events to a different understanding.
So, how do you analyze a political cartoon? Well, oftentimes you need to access prior knowledge to understand it, and that's going to provide you the context. But breaking down these skills will help you to understand the cartoonist point of view. So some characteristics to look for. Symbolism. Symbolism are objects that stand for larger concepts or ideas. For an example, you might see the Grim Reaper, and that's going to represent death, while Uncle Sam might represent the United States. Exaggeration. These are items that are overdone to make a point. Oftentimes, people's physical appearance, of big hair or big ears or big lips. Labeling is to identify people and objects within the cartoon that the cartoonist wants to make extremely clear to the reader. Some questions you want to ask yourself while you're analyzing a political cartoon. What is the issue that the political cartoon is talking about? And what is the cartoonist's point of view or opinion? All political cartoons provide bias, and they show you an exact claim, thesis, or idea or argument that the cartoonist would like to make.
So now we're going to walk you through some different examples of the skills that Mrs. Berg just mentioned. The first one is labeling. Again, where the cartoonist labels or physically writes text on the cartoon itself to help the reader understand what the shape or image is supposed to represent or mean. In this case, the cartoonist labeled the person in the shape of Africa with the word Africa. This again helps you clearly see that this is Africa. There's no doubt. And then they attached two balls and chains to the person of Africa. And by labeling words such as hunger, AIDS, debt, corruption, it makes it very clear what is holding back or chaining down the continent of Africa. All part of labeling.
Then you have symbolism. Cartoonists are going to use objects or symbols to stand for larger concepts or ideas. Here's an example. Take a look at the picture. You've got a person texting while driving, and the words text, and I'm texting while driving are examples of labeling. Then over here you have the Grim Reaper who's texting back, LOL. The Grim Reaper is symbolic of death. So the cartoonist wants you to know, beware of texting while driving because the Grim Reaper could be laughing at you.
Ain't that a powerful cartoon? Exaggeration is probably one of the most popular forms of political cartoons. Again, as we mentioned earlier, this means that usually a body part such as nose or this case hair, sometimes it's the ears or lips, are exaggerated beyond normal proportions to help make a point. Here, Donald Trump's hair is exaggerated to help again, make the point about some of his claims and the poll data.
An analogy is a comparison between two unlike things. This is one of those more complex ideas of political cartoons. This is where the cartoonist is going to compare a complex issue or situation with something that's a little bit more familiar. If you take a look at the picture below, you could see the tree is labeled apartheid, and the person underneath the tree is labeled NP. Now, you're going to need some prior context and some knowledge to understand that NP is the Nationalist Party, and that this is representative of the Nationalist Party that was in charge in South Africa during the apartheid. And the apartheid were very extreme, rigid laws of discrimination. And so this is an analogy of a tree toppling and falling onto someone is representative of the apartheid ending, and that the apartheid collapsed onto the Nationalist Party, meaning that when the apartheid ended, the Nationalist Party lost its control.
Our final one is irony. Irony, or it's ironic. Like a joke that I can make right now. If a tree falls in the woods, doesn't make a sound. That's ironic given our last slide. But when we look at the cartoon, we have our good friend Donald Trump here, who loves to make a lot of comments, right? And one of his big comments this year is build a wall, right? So we use labeling here. We see that labeling, our cartoonist has labeled build a wall, and the cartoonist has labeled some of his platform, some of the things he says, which the cartoonist considers racist, anti-feminist, and so forth, right? Based on those labeling, the cartoonist drew the wall inside Donald Trump's mouth, which is ironic given given the comments and labeling previously said. Well, folks, thanks for enjoying hope you enjoyed our presentation about how to analyze political cartoons. This is Mr. Nofke encouraging you to continue learning. Oops, totally forgot this. So we're going to roll with it because I started to sign off like a radio host. Mrs. Berg's going to walk you through this one while I put my head down in shame.
Okay, so let's practice. Let's take a look at this political cartoon and see exactly the different elements of the cartoon we just talked about. So if you take a look here, an example of symbolism would be this apple. Apple, as we know, is Apple products. This is something that's very familiar in our own culture and our background. Then an example of labeling are these arrows that are pointed around the person holding an iPad, an iTouch, an iPhone. This is an example of labeling. The author wanted to be extremely clear. Then an example of exaggeration is this entire person. Do you really think that someone's going to walk around with all of these devices at once? Probably not. So he's exaggerating that idea. And then what's ironic is at the bottom here, when you look at this one, that is labeled "you broke." So he's being comical and funny with the fact that this person's holding an iPad, an iMac, an iTouch, an iPhone, and actually, in reality, this just makes the person broke in the end. So this is a cartoonist, his claim or his argument is that really when you buy all of these products, you're just wasting your money.
Well, I guess now I can say goodbye, and this is Mr. Nofke signing off. Thanks for watching, and stay classy.
Today we will learn about political cartoons. A political cartoon is a drawing that makes a satirical or humorous point about a politician, political event, or political issue. Political cartoons have been around since the founding of our country, and although you will not always agree with the ideas they express, they usually make a valid point about their subject. Political cartoons aren't always easy to interpret. They use symbolism and often have hidden information. Here's a simple 3-step process you can use to understand any political cartoon. 1. Read everything: the headings, the captions, any titles, and all dialogue. 2. Try to find and understand any symbolism. What do these symbols represent? 3. Almost all cartoons represent an opinion, and usually a critical one. Who or what is being criticized and why? Let's practice this process using a political cartoon. First, read everything. Here we have the word science crowning the heroic female figure on the right, who wields a sword labeled invention, while the figure on the left wears shorts labeled U-boat warfare and carries dead bodies labeled law and commerce. Second, try to find and understand any symbolism. The figure on the left wears a German-style helmet and references the U-boats used by Germany in World War I. Therefore, we can safely assume this figure is meant to symbolize Germany. Since the figure on the right appears to be preparing to fight against Germany, we can assume this figure is meant to be the United States and her allies. Last, all cartoons represent an opinion, and usually a critical one. This political cartoon clearly criticizes Germany, while supporting the use of science and innovation as modern warfare against Germany in World War I. The next time you come across a political cartoon, past or present, you can use this technique to better understand its meaning and political significance.
Watch the videos, read through the notes, then click the links to see what you know and what you don't.